All right. Um, admit all. Hannah, take it away.
Okay, good afternoon and good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Hana Marku. I'm going to be moderating this talk. A very little bit about me. I'm an immigration and refugee lawyer based in Toronto, Canada. I was born in Pristina in Kosovo, and migration rights, frankly, have been an issue in our region for a long time, and I'm very excited to learn more myself by moderating this discussion. I am going to introduce our speakers. I'm going to start with Nijara Ahmetashevich. Nijara is a journalist, an activist, a human rights defender from Sarajevo, focuses on media, human rights violations, war crimes, and migrations. Nijara, do you mind just saying hello very briefly before I move on to reading Nicola's bio? Oh, your microphone is muted.
Hi. Hi, everybody. Hi from Sarajevo.
Great. Thanks, Nijara. Our next speaker is going to be Nikola Kovacevic. Nikola is a human rights lawyer from Serbia and the coordinator of the Asylum and Migration Program at the Center for Research and Development Ideas. He received the 2021 Nansen Refugee Award for Europe for his role in developing Serbia's asylum system. He's represented nearly 30% of those granted asylum in Serbia and is also known for challenging illegal border practices. Since 2015, he's contributed to AIDA and has coordinated ELENA activities in Serbia since 2016. Both under the European Council for Refugees and Exiles, Nikola has litigated asylum cases nationally and internationally, often collaborating with civil society in Hungary, Croatia, and Bulgaria. His work includes cases on collective expulsions, arbitrary detention in transit zones, and misuse of the safe third country concept. In 2021, he was elected to the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture by the Council of Europe's Committee of Ministers. Nikola, do you mind unmuting yourself briefly to say hello to our participants today?
Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here and looking forward to today's panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is going to be Kristina Milona. Kristina is a researcher and investigative journalist based in Tirana, Albania. She is the co-founder of Europe Other, a grassroots collective advocating for migrant justice in Albania. Kristina holds a degree in transnational queer feminist politics from SOAS University of London. Her work focuses on the criminalization of Albanian migrants in the UK, particularly the securitization of Albanian male asylum seekers. She writes regularly for various media outlets on the Italy-Albania migration deal and broader issues of border externalization. Kristina, do you mind saying hello?
Hey everyone, thanks Anna for the introduction, and thanks to everyone for joining us today on a Saturday. Thank you.
Thanks, Kristina. I'll move on to Sanaz Raji. Sanaz is the founder of Unis Resist Border Controls, a national campaign launched in March 2016 that works to end the hostile environment and border controls in UK higher education. Currently, Sanaz is an independent social research foundation fellow at Northumbria University, exploring the nexus between immigration surveillance and marketized higher education in UK universities. Her work has been featured in The Guardian, Times Higher Education, Masina, and Red Pepper magazine, in addition to academic journals and edited books. Good afternoon, Sanaz. Do you mind saying hello?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Hello, and assalam to everyone as well.
And our Our last speaker, last but not least, is Merita Bushi. Merita is a community organizer based in Chicago in the US. She's part of a local group called 33rd Ward Working Families that works in solidarity with various campaigns that stand up with immigrant and refugee communities against austerity and anti-Blackness and other collective struggles. She studied geography and public health at Macalester College in Minnesota. Merita was born and raised in Chicago with roots in Macedonia and Kosovo, where her parents immigrated from, and where during summers growing up, Merita saw the effects of border policy as she helped her family navigate the immigration system. Good morning, Merita.
Good morning from Chicago. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. This is very important work. I'm happy to be here with all of you.
All right, thank you. These are our speakers. I will give a very brief overview of why we're having this conversation today. We have 2 hours, so I'm going to do my best to speak as little as possible and to give our speakers and those of you watching as much time as possible to connect with one another. The Balkans is a place that has produced refugees, and it is also a place for refugee transit. And using a conservative estimate, well over 1 million people fleeing war and other humanitarian disasters have traveled through our region, the Balkan region, since 2015. And the human beings that have taken this route have experienced vicious brutality, primarily by law enforcement, in the form of assault, humiliations, unjustified detention and searches, but also exploitation by human smugglers and human traffickers. The role of the EU has been to find ways to push migrants back, to turn a blind eye to their abuse, and to give incentives to our countries to act as jailers for migrants. Our speakers are going to discuss what anti-migrant policies look like in their respective countries and how to fight back against the dehumanization of migrants in our own countries through organizing and solidarity. And the way that the conversation is structured today is every speaker will be providing a case study of sorts from their respective countries and their respective regions. And I wanted to turn first to Bosnia and Herzegovina as a case study, and I wanted to turn to Nijara specifically. And Nijara, I wanted to start with a really basic question. So how and when did Bosnia and Herzegovina become a transit hub for migrants seeking safety? Can you give us a little bit of background?
Thank you. I will try. In a way, Bosnia was always, at least what we know from the 90s, even was a hub where people used to pass through and to continue toward the EU, but not in such a big numbers. There were a time when it was more or less, but in 2018, Bosnia became a country very busy, to put it in that way, with the people who were passing through. The reason why Bosnia became a transit country only in 2018, there are several reasons. First of all, people were using Serbia, mostly because it was the easiest to pass through Serbia, and Serbia has several borders with the EU member states. Bosnia is very difficult for people to come. All of these people who are coming have to walk through Bosnia. Bosnia has a lot of mountains, a lot of rivers. It's quite dangerous. And plus, we are one of the 10 countries in the world with the highest number of landmines. Landmines are until today a huge issue for migrants as well as for the local population. In 2017, in the second part of the 2017, the violence at the borders of Serbia was becoming really more and more harsh, to put it in that way. And in a way, I connect the murder of the Afghani girl, Madina Husseini, as the moment when people in Serbia who were stuck in Serbia for a long time really understood that it became too dangerous and that they need a new route. And that's when Bosnia became a new active part of the Balkan route, and it remains like that until today. Of course, it's less people passing through the country now, but also it's much harder to know how many people are really in Bosnia at any given moment, because with the help of smugglers, unfortunately, we need to have smugglers. That's the only way, because of the closed borders and the very harsh policies from the EU. People are passing through Bosnia and through the Balkans very fast. Sometimes it takes just a couple of days to reach the EU. However, at this moment, I'm not very sure what will happen, having in mind everything what is happening in EU, that EU is becoming not very good place to live, even for EU citizens, and especially for people who are just arriving. So I don't know how that will reflect on the Balkans. At the moment, Bosnia, as well as the rest of the Balkans, is some kind of like, I don't like that term, but that's the term many use and probably very descriptive. It's a dumping ground. EU is using the other term, which is a return hub. Officially, we are not that, but unofficially, we can see that from Albania and across all other countries in the region.
And you know, even though we're all from the Balkan region, I'm trying to think about, where are people entering Bosnia and where are they exiting? So what borders are they entering through, and which borders are they exiting from?
Everywhere, to put it in
Okay.
that way. The busiest route is from Montenegro through Pljevlja, and then entering in different places in the south of the country. And the other busy route remains all this time across the river Drina. So close to area of Zvornik, but also some other areas are also quite busy. People are going to Croatia. Most of them are using northwest part, which is Bihać, an area around Bihać. But we know that all this time, some people are also trying, and some are finding a way to cross in Herzegovina area, going toward the Adriatic and the Dalmatian coast, and then trying to continue. That road is more difficult, but still quite a lot of people actually made it in that way. I was in Bihać area a month ago. I spent there 10 days, about 10 days. And what is very easy to notice is that, again, there is quite a lot of violent pushbacks from Croatia. It never stopped, actually, but it was not that visible. And during these 10 days, at least one group of people who were pushed back from Croatia I met on a daily basis, sometimes even more, but at least one, including, again, families, women, children, young people, and people are, again, from all over the world.
And I'm really curious about what happens at the physical border. So when people are entering Bosnia, are they going through official border points or between official border points? What happens when they're entering?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's impossible. I mean, everything would be much easier if people can use official borders, but people have to find the alternative ways, which put them very often in danger. At this moment, I'm working on a big journalist story about the landmines, danger of landmines in Bosnia. It's not possible at all to establish how many people got killed in a landmines, because usually it is happening high in mountains, deep in the forests, and nobody really can even like find these bodies or anything. But we can just guess how many. We have this Facebook page, Dead and Missing in the Balkans, and very often we follow the cases of people who just disappeared somewhere close to the borders. We can guess what had happened. Some of them, of course, died while in the rivers or similar, but we can just guess how many people really died. I find many people that I interviewed during this work on this article, who show me videos, photos, and who told me that practically on their way to Croatia, they walked through the minefield. And every time when they are pushed back into the minefield. Croatian police, as they wrote me in an email correspondence we had, is completely aware of existence of the minefields in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It means, they did not say that, but for me, it means that they are, they kind of like consciously push people into the minefields.
I didn't know this, and that
Many
is,
people didn't.
yeah, that is really shocking to hear, because what you're saying is that, yes, the authorities are aware. People are entering through unofficial border points. There's an awareness that, yes, people are passing through, but no attempt to make that safer, is what you're saying.
Not only authorities in Bosnia and Croatia, but European Union, which is the most important player in all of this that we are talking about, is completely aware of minefields, not only on the route through Bosnia, but also it was in Croatia. Now it's clean, more or less. It's never possible to clean it really. But in some of the camps, like Camp Lipa, is quite close to an area that is suspected that there is a possibility that mines or unexploded ammunition from the war is still there. Nobody is doing anything to clean this area, or at least to check if there is something dangerous in these parts or not. Camp is there, and people are aware of it. There are signs that it's dangerous, but it's just like that.
So, can we talk about camps, because you've written about inhumane conditions in camps, and you also talk about international complicity in the conditions of those camps, because they're not just Bosnian Croatians, they are funded by the EU, IOM, UNHCR, DRC. So can you describe, maybe first, what's the purpose of the camps and who is sheltered there?
If you ask me what's the purpose of the camps, not only in Bosnia, but anywhere, it's to concentrate people in one place and to humiliate them, to limit their freedom of movement, to track their data. Practically all these camps are concentration camps. It's a modern concentration camp, which exists not only in the Balkans, but everywhere around Europe. It's very dangerous, and I'm really kind of like sad, disappointed, angry, because nobody is talking about that in that way. I never saw, and I was in quite a few countries around Europe, I never ever saw a kind of like a decent camp, a humane camp. And it's not possible even to build one, because people should not live in camps. People should be free. In Bosnia and Herzegovina is a bit specific case in Europe, and even in the region, I can say, even though it's not much different in other countries, maybe only in Serbia. But Bosnia and Herzegovina, as a state, as a country, is semi-protectorate for 30 years, since the end of the war. Part of this protectorate, by the decision of European Union and European Commission, is that IOM, International Organization for Migration, practically has full protectorate over everything that has anything to do with migrations in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It means that all the EU funding and any funding that is coming to Bosnia for anything that is related to migration, and everything is related to migration at this moment in Bosnia, is not coming to the state, but it's coming through IOM. IOM decides who will get this money and how this money will be spent. IOM has the ultimate word when it's decided on where the camps will be. IOM employs people who are working in camps, not all of them, but a huge number. IOM decides who will go to hospital and who will get care in a hospital, who will not. IOM also decides who can enter camps and who cannot. So, for example, since 2019, I am blacklisted, and for me, it's forbidden to enter the camps. I'm managing to enter camps in different ways, sometimes with more and less success. And what I can tell you is that these places are really bad. Every year, it's worse and worse. Conditions are completely inhumane. Treatment is inhumane. And then we have this Lipa camp, which is kind of like a modern camp, as they call it. EU is very proud they built that. It's in location which is very remote, 20 kilometers from Bihać, 6 kilometers. There is no road or anything. People have to walk. There are no buses. no shops, nothing. It's just containers, wires, cameras, and security and landmines around these people. So that's how EU is imagining. They always tell us it's European standards. So I guess for you, those of you who are living in European Union, that's how you live. That's your standard. We live different lives, so it's not Bosnian standard, but it's EU standard. All this time, I have to say that in Bosnia, we do not have many NGOs working with migrants. One of the reasons is that IOM is the one that decides who can work or not work with the migrants, and many of the people, they just kind of like kick them out in a way, but Bosnia remains one of the countries where solidarity of people toward people remains very strong. It's led by women, which is very interesting, and I'm kind of like it's very touching, some of the stories that you can still, after so many years, encounter around Bosnia in villages, especially, not that many in cities, but villages where people are really welcoming towards people who are coming, passing by their houses, and their doors are still very open. If I may, I will share one of the stories I wrote about a group of women near River Drina in Zvornik area. One of them is this Emina that I'm completely obsessed with. A beautiful old lady that until today is helping migrants while she is living in a very difficult situation in a city where she is not welcome, even though she is born in that city.
And I mean, look, I have so many thoughts about the reasons why our shared history, it makes it quite easy for us to understand what it means to be displaced, to run away from your home, to fear war. I think there's a lot of shared experiences that make that solidarity very natural, or it should make that solidarity very natural.
It's because of that, but when I speak with some of these people, I also think it's a mentality. There is this story about Bosnia, which sometimes is problematic, but I also like it. And in our language, it says kafa viška. So it's like people always make, like when you make a coffee, and that's very similar even in Kosovo and some other countries in the region. When you make a coffee, you never make only for 2 persons. You will make a little bit more if somebody's come by, so that you're ready. When you make lunch, you always make a little bit more than you need. You never know who will knock on your door. And I really think that's part of this solidarity that I'm seeing. At least that's what people told me when I asked these people in the villages who were refugees just yesterday. Is that the reason why they're helping to people? Usually they tell me no, and their answer is it's only people. It's very simple. It's just the people. And that's a basic of solidarity. And I think that EU really needs to be reminded of that, not only when it comes to refugees, but also when it comes to Palestine, but also when it comes to their own citizens. It's something that in the Balkans, even though it's not easy, many issues, many problems, but I do believe that in many parts of the Balkans, we still do make this kafu viška, one more cup of coffee if somebody comes by.
Well, I want to talk about the EU just a little bit more because, Croatia is from the same Balkan region, and you've reported about very violent pushbacks. Like, pushbacks is a very gentle word. People are expelled from an EU border back into Bosnia, and I've never understood how that is legal under international law. Can you maybe explain what is the practice of pushbacks and what kind of options do people have when they're pushed back?
Everything is illegal. But I really question international law. Like, look what's happening in Gaza. What are we talking about? There is nothing anymore. Everything is broken. It doesn't exist. And the migrants are just like, they were just beginning of what is happening for us to see, but we don't see it. In a way, and I'm really sorry for all my friends from Croatia who are here. And of course, I don't generalize, but I think this kafa viška ends somewhere in the northwest Bosnia. They don't make this extra pot. And that's one of the problems why this is possible in Croatia, because the people who are living in Croatia did not react on time. They were aware of this. I remember a story. I was part of one very, very big and very important Croatian NGO, IU Sirius. And I remember the days back in 2016 and 17 when we were receiving reports from areas in Croatia where people used to call police when they see migrants. So they were participating in this. They were aware that they're going to be beaten, that they're going to be pushed back, but they were part of this. So it's a problem, of course, of policy, because EU wants Croatia to push people back, to perform this role of kind of like a, ugly Balkan people who are. It's like always in the history. We will do dirty job for them. And they will kind of like pretend that they live in democracy, about human rights and all this blah, blah, blah shit that they are usually talking. But and Croatia got this task. But for me, it's a problem why they're so happy to do it, to perform it. What is the option for people when they are pushed back? The option is that they will die in a minefield, that they will be returned to one of the camps in Bosnia, which are miserable places, or that police inside of the Balkans, who are by large at this moment paid or instructed by the EU how to obey, that they will just play a ping pong between countries with people. So they will be pushed back a little bit to Serbia, from Serbia to Macedonia, So people are going around. Sometimes they do that by themselves. Very often Bosnian police, I have to say, also is pushing people back, and they're very proud. They even mentioned that in the yearly report, when they submit that to European Union, they describe it as an act of preventing illegal crossing, which is pushback when you translate it. Not on such scale as it is happening from Croatia, but Croatia is part of EU, and also Croatia do have an issue with the government that remains far right, and many people who support this approach toward non-white people. I don't want to generalize, but for me, it's sometimes I really question, like, how is it possible that people in Croatia are not everybody, but it's very small number of people who are screaming because of this.
Okay, Nijara, I could speak with you all morning, but we've already eaten up a whole hour. So please, the other speakers, please forgive me. We're going to come back to this, and we're going to open up the discussion. Please forgive me for cutting you off. I would love to speak with you some more, but I'm going to turn to our next speaker, who is Nicola, who is going to give us a sense of what this battle looks like in Serbia. And so, Nicola, please forgive me for getting to you a little bit late. I want to start with the same very basic question that I asked Nijara. I want to know from you, how and when did Serbia become a transit hub for migrants who are seeking safety? Can you give us a bit of background from Serbia?
Yes. Thank you, Hannah, and thank you, Nijara, for an inspiring presentation. We are on the same page, more or less, because the trends and the context in the Balkans in general, it's more or less the same in each and every country. So when we talk about a certain country being a transit country, I hate this expression, because this is the expression used by the state authorities as a justification for the domestic purposes, saying that these people are just crossing and they're not going to stay. And I think this is a big issue, because I think each country should strive to provide protection to all of those people who are in need. And if we consult the Refugee Convention, the European Convention, and so on and so forth, a country is a transit one when it fails to develop its asylum system, when it fails to develop a system of protection which should provide these people with the possibility to enjoy human rights which they're entitled to. So if you read the Refugee Convention, if you read the European Convention for Human Rights, and then if you compare it, for example, to Nijara's analysis of the reception facilities in Bosnia and Herzegovina or in Serbia, you can see that these people have no other choice. And that if we would be in the same situation, and we were 30 years ago in terms of the region, no one stayed in Hungary, Slovakia, or I don't know, some other country which also considered itself to be a transit country, but they went on to the system in which they are allowed to enjoy the rights to which they are entitled to by the mere fact that they had to flee their country in order to avoid persecution, violation of or serious human rights violation. So this is the biggest problem in the Balkans, that all these countries and the governments, regardless of being right, center, or left wing, have failed to establish a fair and effective asylum system, which would provide more people than it's the case right now, much more people to stay and seek safety. And in that way, displays something that for which I believe is the core principle of the human rights protection, is the solidarity. To take part in the protection, not saying we're going to take EU money, we're going to develop the infrastructure, but we're going to organize transport from North Macedonia to Croatia, Bosnia, or Hungary, and these people would leave. So this is the hypocrisy. And if we go back in 2008, when Serbia got its asylum system, the numbers speak for themselves. Since 2008 to this date, I think 265 people were granted asylum, for which I believe is a failure, because we probably had more than 2 million people transiting. So the narrative of transit country, the narrative that we are poor, that we cannot do much, is something that we should not accept. And there are several reasons for it. First of all, it's your international responsibility. It's not a question of good faith or not. So you need to establish the system. Secondly, a lot of money has been invested by EU and other international donors to establish the asylum system. And the policy of financing asylum systems in the Balkans has proved to be very ineffective, because this money was given to the authorities and to the governments who have failed to use it in a proper way. And not to build the camps where people will stay for 3 days, but to build systems in which people can arrive, where there are going to be vulnerability assessment, we're going to have trained asylum officers, we're going to have inclusion and integration policies which will allow these people to integrate properly. All of this has failed, and unfortunately, after this, European Union has give up from these countries developing asylum system. As Nijara said, now we are portrayed as countries which should do the dirty work, the dirty job, in order to decrease the number of arrivals to Europe. So I hope this answers at least a part of your question, and please let me know if I missed something.
No, you didn't. Thank you for problematizing that term. Transit, that term transit. I will not think of that phrase in the same way again.
Oh.
And because the Balkans is a unique location, and because the borders are still porous enough where people can get through, I've always thought of transit as just meaning you're transited from one place to another, but there's a political meaning behind that phrase, which I understand now. So thank you. And talking very concretely, and maybe this has changed over time, where are people entering? And for the most part, if they are trying to exit, where are they trying to exit?
So the geography is very simple. So the Middle East conflicts, Afghanistan, Syria, people fleeing Iran, and some other places in the region. It's very simple. Most of them end up in Turkey, and then they follow either a route through Greece or through Bulgaria. As someone who was also a member of the international body, such as the CPT, I really had the possibility to observe the migration policies in Turkey, in Greece, in Greek islands. I was recently on the border between Bulgaria and Turkey. So when you follow this route, you can basically see that you either go to Bulgaria and then enter Serbia, from North Macedonia to Serbia. That's the most frequent routes. Of course, people come from Montenegro, from Kosovo, but what I want to say is that these are the two most frequent routes. What is important to say is that what happens on the Greek islands for the people coming from Bodrum and Izmir, what happens in the area of Edirne or Kirklarey when they enter from Turkey to Bulgaria, or what happens between North Macedonia and Serbia, it's more or less the same. So the entry points are the points where there is a twilight of the human rights and international refugee law. And Nijara has portrayed this very, very sharply and very precisely, that since especially March 2016, the famous EU-Turkey statement or EU-Turkey deal, when the Europe for the first time tried to externalize this issue, but in a very, let's say, lucrative way for Turkey, we can see that from the March 2016, the harmful border practices or the clusters of human rights violations which are happening in the border areas have become a rule. So this is when we started to hear the term the game, the pushbacks or basically police and military committing serious human rights violations at the borders. So the main entry points are there, but as I said, the harmful border practices are happening from the country of origin to the first country of refuge, to the external borders of the European Union. In Serbia, the external borders of the European Union are Hungary, Croatia, and Romania. And as someone who has been operating in this field for the past 15 years, you can see the pattern of behavior, which is more or less identical. But some of the border police, let's say, are more, trying to leave the impression on the people on the move. They are trying more hard than to simply send them back from one country to another. So the entry and exit points from each and every country imply that people are arbitrarily detained, that they are sent from one country to another without the examination of the individual circumstances and the risks of refoulement. This basically implies collective expulsion. And in most of the cases, or in many cases, this implies also violence, which implies physical and psychological ill treatment. So if you analyze even the practice of the European Court of Human Rights in the recent Greek case on a pushback in Evros region, you can see that the court has basically found multiple violations of the European Convention, which means that pushback is not only sending one person from one country to another, but it also means detaining this person arbitrarily, no access to lawyer, no access to interpreters, no access to justice. It's a clandestine operation in which countries would, in most of the cases, basically say, we have never seen these people, unless you're Hungary, who is very proud, and I heard that Bosnia is also very proud by putting the data on their website. So basically, it's an endless game, which implies that countries have decided to refrain from their own laws, from their own constitutions, and from their own international obligations. And harmful border practices have become something that is a normal thing. And that's the context of Serbia. So in Serbia is pushing people back to Bulgaria and North Macedonia, but other countries are pushing back people to Serbia. So it's an endless game being played on all the borders. And as I said, there is no indicator which would at least tell us when this will stop. This is the current state of affairs. So we are now witnessing the sharp decline of human rights protection at the borders. And for me, this is something that implies the crisis of the rule of law in European countries, European Union countries, and Balkan countries.
You know, I really liked what you said about the phrase transit countries earlier, because it is an abdication of responsibility. That if our Balkan countries are transit countries, then, as you say, why would we be required to develop an asylum system or services for refugee settlement in our countries? And in my country, I feel a real sense of shame around the fact that our Kosovan government is very happy to make detention deals with places like Denmark and the United States. And I understand that you've pushed quite hard for Serbia to live out the principles of the Refugee Convention. Representing 30% of all asylum seekers is quite an astounding number. And I wanted to ask you, before you started representing refugees, what did the asylum system in Serbia look like? And layered on top of that, what is the attitude of the Serbian justice system more generally towards people seeking asylum?
Yes. It's very hard to say. And this quote of the text I use in my biography is something which was extracted from the Nansen Award nominee. So when you say 30 or 35%, it's not so much. It's in comparison to the total, it's a lot. But from the onset of Serbian asylum system, which was April 2008, until then it was UNHCR who was in line with the gentleman agreement, providing, let's say, support to these people. Like IOM took over the system in Bosnia. That was the case with UNHCR in Serbia until 2008. More or less, the problems have always been the same. But we had, let's say, good years, better years, and very bad years. So, and in general, when you see, for example, as a lawyer who, takes people to the interviews or to courts and everything, you can see even that the decision makers are the ones who are not, they are trained. They have a decent knowledge how to recognize the elements of the refugee definition, how to grant someone asylum and everything. But the problem is that Serbia is really trying hard to keep the number of people who are being granted protection to a minimum level. So this securitization of the asylum process and the credibility assessment, especially in the past several years, has been a very big obstacle for people to obtain justice. And you mentioned how, for example, Kosovo is willing, to take Latin American refugees or Danish prisoners on their territory, but at the same time, people who are transiting through Kosovo or through Serbia to any other country and who are applying for asylum are not able to get it. So you see basically this very, in my opinion, very ridiculous and hypocritical attitude of the state authorities, saying that we are humane, but we're such a poor and transit country. We want to help these people when they come. We give them bread, we give them water, we give them medical and health care. But refugees need more than just, I don't know, 72-hour hostel, and basic. So the system more or less looked the same. Maybe I contributed slightly to the credibility rate a bit higher at one point. But as I said, Serbian asylum system and the credibility assessment is influenced not by the asylum officers who are doing the interviews and want to make a positive decision, but by the security and upper Ministry of Interior persons in charge, who are basically sometimes even forcing asylum officers to create circumstances and facts which would lead to a negative decision. So this is why it's very hard to obtain international protection. And I don't know, I can give you a couple of examples. There are some very progressive decisions in which people who really had, I don't know, SGBV and human trafficking background recognized as refugees, which is a very big thing. And on the other side, you have Syrians who are rejected. You have people fleeing Afghanistan who are rejected. So it's Serbian asylum system is very unpredictable. It's very much influenced by non-professionals, even though it has wonderful individuals within the state authorities who know how to do their job, but they are not calling the shots. So that is why we still can only say that Serbia cannot be considered as a safe third country. And if we put this in the context of the EU Pact on Asylum and Migration, if we put this in the context of Hungary, Croatia, or European Union countries trying somehow to designate Serbia as a safe third country, it is impossible to do it right at this particular moment, because Serbian asylum system is completely unfair, ineffective, and unpredictable.
And what you've described is really the gap between the law, right, and the actual spirit of what we would call justice.
Yes.
And what I know about your background is that, yes, you're a lawyer, but you're also an activist. You connect with your clients on a human level, and you know about their lives and care about their lives. And so I see you as operating both inside the legal system and kind of outside of it. And how do you personally deal with that tension, right, of dealing with the law? The law is concerned with making sure that you meet the legal definition of who's a convention refugee and who's not. And justice, which I see as really being distinct and over here somewhere, because justice would involve not just the legal recognition, but it would also involve access to services like shelter and employment, psychosocial support. How do you deal with the tension between these very different needs?
Unfortunately, it became very simple. You provide people with the information on what can they expect if they decide to stay in Serbia, and what is the level of access to rights which they're going to obtain. So as a lawyer, my main task is to not obtain international protection, but to prevent these people being sent back to unsafe third country or a country of origin. So when you operate in a system such as the Serbian one, this is your main goal, that these people at least stay on the territory of Serbia where they're safe in the most profound way. So basically, when you litigate cases in the context of people who are just passing by, it is very hard because most of the people leave at one point. And if you want to challenge, for example, harmful border practice, like a pushback case from Hungary to Serbia, there was a recent judgment last week by the European Court of Human Rights. It's called HQ and Others versus Hungary. And it is a landmark case because this is the first case in which the so-called embassy procedure of Hungary, which was established in 2020 during COVID, has been finally disputed in the individual case. So this case basically implied that you had to invest a lot of effort to assist. It was a student from Afghanistan who was studying in Budapest. One day the police arrived, pick him up and throw him back to Serbia, so expel him back to Serbia. So the entire operation implied that you had to go there, collect the testimony, collect the power of attorney, establish the relationship of trust, host this person in Serbia for a certain period of time. But very soon after, this person left. And today Hasib is in Vienna, which is fine. And I'm very happy for him. But imagine how hard it is, because this case started in 2020 or 21. The finalization of the case was several weeks ago. So in 5 years, with this wonderful human being who knew the importance of litigating the case before the European Court of Human Rights, you had to maintain touch. You had to provide him support in Hungary, then in Serbia, then to stay in touch. So basically, this job in these kind of circumstances has become impossible to achieve a systemic change. So if you see, I don't know, the number of people who are participating here, I think Nijara was very right. Most of the people in this region, they don't care about how these people are being treated. Most of the people do not understand the importance of providing protection to people who are in need of international protection. So litigating or being an activist or being an advocate for refugee rights in this region has become a fight for individual destinies, not a fight for systemic changes, because basically we are helpless in this kind of political context to produce a systemic change, even though we are trying, because the policies of the countries have developed to an extent where nobody even cares about international human rights or international refugee law. Nijara mentioned Gaza, for example. So I think this is the perfect example. So I think that we live and operate in the time and in the circumstances where there is, as I said, a huge backslide of international law in general. And to operate in these kind of systems, the most important thing for me as sometimes independent, sometimes an NGO lawyer, sometimes an activist, is to provide the best you can in individual cases and to leave the trace in the domestic or international jurisprudence that something is wrong, and hope that one day this kind of jurisprudence might influence some future stakeholders, policymakers, or the governments when the time comes to restore refugee protection in Europe. And this is not something that we can expect anytime soon.
I feel that level of frustration all the time. I believe I share that with you. And I have to hold on to the belief that everything matters. Everything on a small level and everything on an individual level, it does matter in some grand equation. And with respect to our region, I'm going to turn to Christina, because Albania is an interesting example of a place that has not seen the same numbers that Bosnia and Serbia have seen in terms of people moving through Albania, but has also become a site of very contested detention practices. And Christina, your writings were actually my first exposure to this, the migrant detention becoming an Albanian issue. So can you tell us a little bit about how did Albania become a location for migrant detention?
Thank you, Hannah, for the overview and for the question. So actually, for quite some time in the last few years, Albania has been mentioned as a potential partner state to be the place where Europe or other wealthy countries would build offshore detention centers. If we go back in time, in around 2021, it was actually former Home Secretary in Britain, Priti Patel, who proposed very publicly about Albania being a site where the UK in post-Brexit would set up some detention centers where they would send rejected asylum seekers there. It was also Alexander Downer, who is actually the architect of the Australian offshoring model, which is very similar legally basis with the Italy-Albania deal, who was actually promoting a lot Albania as a convenient place, not only because of its geographic position, but also because it would be, for various other reasons, like a place where they could set up these centers. But back then, Edi Rama, the Albanian Prime Minister, was quite indignated about this proposal from the UK. He even said that Albania cannot become like the country where richer, wealthy states can, quote-unquote, dump migrants. But apparently he changed his mind some years ago, because he accepted to do and strike the deal with Italy, which forces Albania granting some territories to Italy. And in exchange, Italy to build these centers there, like offshoring centers, where basically will be operating under Italian jurisdiction for conducting return procedures and fast-track asylum processing. So all in all, like extraterritorial asylum management, let's say. But I think it's also very important to go a bit deeper into also the historical relations between Italy and Albania, because I feel like a lot of researchers, a lot of journalists have called out this deal neocolonialistic, but I think that it has an extra layer when you see that Italy has been the one signing this agreement with Albania, because if we go back in the 90s, in a period when after the fall of communism, a lot of Albanians escaping from poverty, let's say the political turmoil of that year, they searched for a better life to Italy, and they went through boats there, and Italy didn't welcome them as much as our Albanian prime minister tried to portray it as a moral debt that nowadays Albanians have to pay back to Italy, the so-called welcoming and the reception that Albanians received then when they went to Italy. On the contrary, after some years, in 1997, actually the Italian government introduced a naval blockade, which is, in my opinion, one of the first form and precedent of the extraterritoriality from Italy, which basically deployed and moved some naval ships in order to to intercept and push back some of the boats with Albanian refugees that were seeking sanctuary when trying to reach Italy. And actually it led to a tragedy, or better say a massacre, when some of these Italian naval ships pushed back one Albanian boat called Kateri Radës, and that led to a shipwreck and to around 80 Albanians who were drowned. So imagine, like 30 years later, the Albanian prime minister citing as a moral debt this welcoming that Albanians received during those years, and saying that that's the reason why Albania changed its course, and now it's deciding to provide this territory for Italy to build these offshore centers in order to do some of the asylum procedures there. Maybe if I can very quickly explain a bit in practice, like how they work, the functions of these centers. So the deal was announced for the first time. It was made public in November 2023, and it was negotiated in secrecy with closed doors, like no one knew. And basically when it was made public, of course that it caused a lot of outrage in both countries, especially in Albania. There were some reaction from civil society saying that this deal violates the constitutionality of Albania, because basically in order to grant some parts of the territory, you need the authorization of the president, who was not even aware of such deal being announced. And also the numerous other violations of European Convention and international law that this deal provides, right? So in practice, what happens is that now under this deal, Italy is allowed to transfer some people to these centers in Albania. At the beginning, in the first operations that is carried out, Italy, the Italian Coast Guard, the one that, for instance, rescue migrants in international waters, then they do like some kind of, let's say, screening there, like they divide the migrants that they rescue. And basically, this deal is applicable to only to male migrants who come from the so-called safe countries that Italy has designated in its internal list, and also the ones that after they are subjected to a pre-medical screening in the ship where they are held after they are rescued by the Italian Coast Guard. If they are designated as non-vulnerable, then they will be sailing for 2 more days towards the Albanian port where they have the first Italian center. So in total, in Albania now, we have 2 Italian centers, one which is located in an Albanian port called the Shëngjin Harbor. In this small center, the procedures that are carried out are identification and some medical screening. So basically, in practice, when migrants are transferred from international waters in the Mediterranean to the centers in Albania, once they are disembarked to the Albanian port, then they are escorted to this small center called hotspot in the Albanian port. There again, like they go through identification procedure, which means like what are their nationalities and some other basic details. And also, again, there is like an extra medical screening that they presumably do in order to understand if they have some minors or some other forms of vulnerabilities, as they call it, that would basically make these migrants transfer them unfit for further detention to the other centers. And actually, in the first 3 operations of this kind, like migrants being transferred from international waters from near Italian waters to Albania, there have been many cases of minors being sent there, even people with physical vulnerabilities that having difficulty in moving. So that shows a lot about how cruel and how inefficient is the system that takes place prior to their transfer to Albania. So once they decide in this hotspot who is going to get transferred further to the other center, then they send the rest of the people back to Italy, and the rest of migrants goes to this other center, which is located in Jadar, like half an hour drive from the hotspot in Shëngjin. Actually, these centers are built in a former military base. It's quite in the middle of nowhere, let's say, area. Like it has no like medical centers nearby, no facility. It's quite remote area, I must say. And this enclave, this huge enclave surrounded by an apartheid wall, like 7-meter high metallic wall. It's built in this area nestled between a mountain called Kakariç and also Drin River. So just to give you some contextual basis about the enclave. And at the first operation, the people that unfortunately were transferred to the second center in Jadar, they would normally go through asylum procedures, like asylum application. And basically, the asylum procedures that the Italian government applies are based on the concept of safe country, which basically now people coming from these safe countries with presumably a small rate of granting refugee protection, they'll be subjected to fast-track asylum processing, which means that they would be held there arbitrarily and waiting for their asylum request to be processed within a 28-day time frame. Actually, from the operations that have been taking place so far, all these procedures of, taking the people from the hotspot in the harbor to the Jadar enclave and processing their asylum request has taken place in a record time of only 3 to 4 days.
So can we pause there?
Yes,
So this is what you're describing. You're describing a system in which people are taken to Shëngjin, which, by the way, for people who don't know Albania, Shëngjin is also a very popular vacation spot. It's a place for tourism. And there's something very jarring about having it be a fun beach location and also a place where migrants are detained. But they're sorted in Shëngjin and then taken to Jadar. And in Jadar, they're undergoing some kind of refugee determination while in detention. And I mean, Christina, is there a hearing room there? Who are the decision makers? How can they have access to interpretation or legal services while located in Jadar? And how do you make a decision in those conditions in 3 days? Do you know about what that looks like on the inside?
I absolutely agree. Like, imagine how traumatizing the whole journey for these people must have been, like working for years, trying, to get to Europe. And then once you try to step into European soil, you're told that, oh, you're going to get shipped to Albania, and they don't even know where Albania is. And basically, it's crazy, like how fast these procedures took place. And basically, everything takes place remotely. So all the hearings, all the court hearings are done through video, like teleconferencing, video camera. And you pointed out quite rightly about the huge violation of the right to defense. Like we know that even in other scenario, even if these migrants would be, let's say, moved to Italy, still it's very difficult. It's very hard to, get to talk to your lawyer, to the one that is going to provide legal representation for you, right? And imagine in this case when the migrants, the only way that they can talk to the lawyers is through video conferencing. It's absolutely crazy. It's absolutely nuts. Like, this is basically how procedure-wise is taking place, like remotely. And there have been some, let's say, independent monitoring teams that right after they heard that there is like this deportation, this transfer taking place to Albania, because it also takes some time, right? Like in the first operation when there were these ships taking the migrants, we were told, like there was a lot of media presence. So also this gave time logistically wise for some of the teams to travel and be there, because even though it's strictly forbidden to enter these centers, it's very hard to gain authorization. There are a few exceptions for deputies, for Italian deputies, for members of the European parliaments, and whenever there has been some deportation and transfer with a naval ship to Albania, there have been a huge presence of these deputies coming, traveling, and making sure that they observe, they see how all these procedures take place. But if you just allow me to add something else regarding to the functionality of the centers in very simple terms. So what I referred to so far is just for the first operations, but then they were kind of legally put at a halt by the judicial authorities in Italy, which sent a request to the European Court of Justice asking if these remote asylum procedures taking place in Jadar are legal or not. So that's the reason why the Italian government has stopped doing this kind of operation by, intercepting people in international waters. Now I'm quoting their technical language. And now they have changed the functionality of these centers. They have revamped them into deportation centers. So basically in March this year, the Italian government issued a decree which basically designated the centers and the building there in Jadar to serve as function as repatriation centers for migrants that have like a deportation order and await like their forceful removal. So unfortunately, that means that migrants that are locked up and detained in centers within Italy can be transferred to Albania. And this has been the case from March onwards. There have been, if I'm not mistaken, 4 deportations of this kind. I've been present as a journalist in all of them, and I've been really shocked by this spectacularization of violence, like, this symbolic violence of using naval ships and, taking migrants handcuffed. I even managed to speak with one of the migrants that was part of this operation, and he told me that he was handcuffed for many, many hours one day prior to the day when he was deported to Albania, and they are not even allowed to use restroom. Imagine, like they are handcuffed and they wait to be deported to a country that they barely know after living in Italy for many, many years. That's the case, and that's the story for many of them, unfortunately.
And of course, we understand that the Meloni government is a far-right government. It has no love, really, for refugees or respect for their rights. So when we say that someone is being deported, I think most people think, well, they must have had a fair hearing and they just didn't meet the legal test. And therefore, it's completely fine for them to be deported. There's an assumption that a failed refugee went through some kind of legal process. But I'm not an Italian lawyer, but I would cast into doubt whether a Meloni government would actually be providing meaningful access to justice to its refugee claimants. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Maybe to get back to these recent deportations, like the operations where they transfer migrants directly from Italian soil to Albania. I've seen like how Meloni and other far-right politicians in Italy keep saying and keep pushing of the narrative that the migrants that we dump to Albania are highly dangerous criminals, and we're doing a big favor to Italy because what, at the end, why all this is happening? It's in the name of public security, right? In Italy. So this is actually a myth that we really need to strongly debunk. Not that I want to fall into this narrative of good migrants versus bad migrants, because there are systems that criminalize. Italy should provide more assistance and more services for the people to legalize their status, and also to provide more safe and humanitarian routes so people don't resort to these undignified and dangerous routes of risking their lives to reach Italy, and then, you know what, after that they can even still get deported to Albania. So I've seen how Meloni and Piantedosi, who is the Minister of Interior in Italy, since this operation started, they kept saying and pushing about this narrative that we need to do this type of treatment, to handcuff migrants, to put them in Albania because they are criminals. And this is absolutely not true. Like we have managed to get in touch with some of the stories, the miserable life stories of migrants that are currently still held up there. They are just migrants that were caught up without paperwork, working maybe without papers because of the system failing them. So are these really the dangerous migrants that Meloni is speaking about? Like, what is this really? Like, it's insane, this type of narrative that they are feeding to the public, really. And yeah, like we are trying with other researchers and other independent teams to understand like what's happening, what are some violations inside these centers. And we have seen really grave cases of people with a lot of health vulnerabilities. Like we had even a person, a migrant locked up in Jadar, that discovered while staying there that he's HIV positive. So imagine like being in Jadar there with that limited access to health services and have such condition. It's really, really cruel indeed.
And I want to talk about you said the public security myth. We paint migrants and refugees as these very dangerous people, and that's the reason for why we need to dehumanize them. And I understand that you've also written about the criminalization of the Albanian diaspora that exists in the United Kingdom. So this is not something new for Albanians. Can you maybe talk about the connections really between the forms of demonization that we see used for people detained in Shëngjin and Jadar, and the very same kind of demonization that you can read in the English press about how dangerous Albanian migrants are? Can you talk a little bit about those connections?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I mean, I mostly researched about the British context, like how the Albanian male asylum seekers are, you know, suddenly transformed and targeted and scapegoated by the politicians there and the government as this bogus asylum seeker because it's Albanians, they come from a safe country, from a NATO member state like Albania. So in the last years, we have seen like how there has been this huge focus and spotlight on Albanian migrants by targeting and demonizing them as criminals that are mostly connected to organized crime groups. So basically this whole targeting through the ideological lenses of war on drugs, in the sense that we need to stop Albanians from entering the UK because they only bring criminality, they only bring drugs. So to interlink it to maybe the other experiences of other migrants and how they're being targeted and demonized coming from other region like North Africa, for instance, I would see some similarities still, because it's mostly like this gendered form of racism, right? Like how it's mostly men being targeted, mostly targeted from these xenophobic policies. And I think that to connect it also to solidarity and mobilizing on the ground, I think this is very important parallel to draw in, especially when we organize protests or when we as activists go on the ground and meet some of the communities there. We, every time we meet with some of the inhabitants, for instance, in Jadar, in this area where the centers are built, we always remind ourselves that we have been ourselves, deported, forcefully deported, detained. Albanians still largely remain one of the most subjected groups to Frontex deportation, to detention. Like, if you only see like how many of them are now detained in deportation centers in the UK, for instance, and the immigration policies have become so restrictive and draconian against Albanians in Britain that we have seen even cases of suicides among Albanian men. Like in December 2023, there were 2 Albanian men that committed suicide in some deportation centers in England, because this whole narrative has been very vitriolic against them and has trickled down in the access that they have to asylum services, basically, and in the way that they are treated in also these reception centers, let's say.
So I think this is an excellent bridge to the next portion of our conversation, which is going to discuss really how the Global North enacts practices in their home countries that are incredibly hostile, and the hostility that is experienced in the Global North is also exported outwards in the manner that you and Nicola and Nijara have described. And I'm very conscious of the time. Otherwise, Christina, there was so much more that I would want to ask you. But before we change geographies and move to the UK and the US, I wanted to take a pause here and see if there is anyone who's been watching so far who wanted to ask any of our first 3 speakers a question.
I would like to, sorry, hi. Do you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Valentina. Hi.
Hello. I don't have a question right now, but I just want to mention that Italy has been financing the technical support to Libyan authorities to manage migration flows since 2017 with a memorandum agreement post refugee crisis in Europe that from 2015. So what is happening right now with the hotspot is not necessarily related to the actual only to the actual fascist government of Meloni, but it relates to, I mean, the detention centers in Libya are atrocious, really atrocious, and we've been like Italy's been paying for these atrocities since many years. So it's worse than it seems. than it is, as Christina was saying. I just wanted to mention this.
So, Christina, I don't know if you had a response to that, since it was about Italy, but I think, sorry, I think, Christina, that I wanted to check in with you if you wanted to comment further.
No, not really.
Okay. I think we're going to have an interesting discussion trying to bridge what the detention and dehumanization looks like in the Balkans is directly related to policies and attitudes that exist in the West. And given that the Balkans is also a place that has produced many refugees, we have a quite sizable diaspora presence in the West. And we are directly impacted by policies that make migrants' lives difficult, by policies that detain migrants, strip them of their status, and subject them to dehumanizing treatment. And for that reason, we are going to shift focus and turn now to the UK and the US. I'm conscious of the fact that Sanaz and Merita, I've eaten into some of your speaking time, so I'm happy to extend the conversation further so that we have enough time to hear from both of you. But I wanted to turn to Sanaz first because so there was a meeting to discuss, this panel discussion, and Sanaz used this term, hostile environment, and of course I had heard of that term before and never really thought about that. But as we were speaking further, it's a hostile environment that starts in the West and it extends outwards from there. The anti-refugee rhetoric that we see, the imperialist practices that we see, the racism that we see in the West, it leads to mass displacement, it leads to war, it leads to genocide, and it directly touches not just those who are physically in the Balkan region, but also our diasporas who live in the West. And Sanaz, I was really hoping to maybe start with a question to bridge these two geographies. I wanted to know if you had any thoughts about how the treatment of migrants in the global north is connected to what we see in the Balkans.
It's a big one, Hannah. Thank you so much for the introduction. And again, thank you to the Balkan Solidarity Network for inviting me to speak. Maybe I want to just turn that around and sort of look at the historical roots of bordering in the United Kingdom. I think you can tell from my accent, I am not born here. I myself am a migrant here, but I think it's important to kind of look at that historical root because I think then it kind of sort of it connects to what's happening in the Balkans, and of course what everyone else has said concerning the bordering processes in the Balkans at the current time. So to understand the present-day UK bordering regime under what we call the hostile environment policy, one needs to travel back to 1905 and the creation of Britain's first Immigration Act, the Aliens Act, and this law was designed to really halt poor Jewish migrants fleeing anti-Semitic violence in the Russian Empire from seeking sanctuary in Britain. I think this is something that you've heard before because we've seen this with every other case since 1905. Nadine El-Anani argues in Bordering Britain, Law, Race, and Empire that before the introduction of the Aliens Act of 1905, British subjects attempting to move within the British Empire encountered barriers imposed by racist immigration policies. And with the introduction of the Aliens Act of 1905, El-Anani argues that this set the tone to target, quote, racialized British subjects and the Commonwealth citizens, end quote, by, quote, making people categorized as aliens disproportionately vulnerable to harm and premature death, either because they were turned away at the border or through exposure to violence and destitution in Britain, end quote. So as people began to liberate themselves from the yoke of British colonialism, El-Anani explains that UK's post-war immigration policies would ensure that whiteness was seen as a marker of Britishness and to deprived colonized populations the ability to lawfully enter Britain while at the same time denying them access to stolen colonial wealth through infrastructure, employment, healthcare, welfare, safety, and opportunity. And then finally, El-Anani describes the post-war UK immigration regime as a means through which the country transitioned from a colonial power that was extractive to being a, quote, space of domestic colonialism masquerading as post-colonial nation, end quote. And we can clearly see what El-Anani means when just 2 months ago, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer laid out a proposal for Labour's new immigration policy. And I mean, I have lived in this country for 20 years, and there have been just a sea of new immigration policies, new immigration laws. But in his speech, Starmer said that without tightening immigration controls, the UK risks, quote, becoming an island of strangers, end quote. So Starmer further states that becoming a citizen of the UK is now, quote, a privilege that must be earned, not a right, end quote. By doing this, he laid out a new set of conditions, which includes, and this has not been instituted as law, but refugees who have come illegally or unlawfully into the UK will now not be allowed to apply for British citizenship. There'll be English language requirements across all routes, including for those who are dependents on the dependents visas. Migrants on work visas will now have to live 10 years in the UK as opposed to 5 years in order to apply for leave to remain. And there'll be more stringent requirements for skilled worker visas. So this is like,
Sanaz, can I ask a
yeah.
question about that? So when you listed the categories of people who are now going to experience tighter controls, and you say refugees who enter unlawfully. I know that phrase is used a lot, but I find it very funny because the UK is an island, and most refugees are unless they have visas already, most refugees are not applying for a visa before they flee their country. So I'm wondering about whether you have any thoughts around what seems like, frankly, from the outside, like a national obsession with the UK being overrun, when I think statistically it's a pretty small number of people who are going to the UK compared to other places like Turkey or even some of the Balkan countries we've talked about. Can you maybe talk about how you see it from the inside out?
Right. Well, I mean, there isn't any safe routes for someone to claim asylum in the UK.
Right.
So, I mean, like, the system is so restrictive in that way. I mean, it's again, as you mentioned, it's a national obsession. This has been, we're talking from the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s onwards. There's this obsession about, especially racialized migrants coming into the UK. So it's really down to that. It's again, harkening back to what Nadine El-Nani says, it's about maintaining a certain level of whiteness in England, England, Britain in general, all over the UK essentially. So that's really where it's coming from. I want to go into this discussion on hostile environment because I really want to unpack what it means, because I think the term that maybe you have been using, or maybe other individuals, especially from the US perspective, is, oh, well, there is migrants are imbued in a hostile environment, in terms of Trump's policies, Biden's policies, Obama's, et cetera. But here is a very specific policy. So, to go back, in the early 2000s when Labor was, in power, they had an open door policy for migration, but they had a very restrictive policy for asylum seekers. And because of this open door policy, lots of Polish people came over, and then the British National Party, which is a neo-fascist party, began to claim that white British people were being deliberately excluded in favor of Polish citizens, which obviously was not true. But this was ramped up in the far right media. And of course, that's when Labor began to jump on this right-wing bandwagon by promoting a policy of British jobs for British workers, which I'm sure everyone, if you were around in 2009, you heard that expression. And the consistent recycling of stories in the far right press about bogus asylum seekers, bogus students, and Polish migrants ensured a joint conservative liberal Democrat win in the 2010 general election. We get to 2010, we get to 2012. Theresa May said in an interview in The Telegraph in 2012 that she would create here in Britain a really hostile environment for illegal migrants. So basically, the whole policy of the Conservative or the coalition government at the time was to bring down net migration statistics and to really play up to the far right, and to also kind of contain the far right at the same time, that yes, we too are very difficult and we're going to be very draconian on again, migrants who are undocumented in the UK. And by doing this, they created in the Immigration Acts of 2014 and 2016, which imposed tougher restrictions, especially on undocumented migrants, which also then began to expand onto even migrants with visas as well. And, by doing this, they created, so basically, it's illegal for private landlords to rent property to people without legal status in the UK. It basically prevents undocumented migrants from obtaining driver's license and bank accounts. It introduced the international health surcharge fee in 2015. The fee at the time in 2015 was $200 per year. That's £200 per year. Today, the international health surcharge fee is the astronomical over £1,000 per year, with the student visa holders paying over $700 per year. And also, the National Health Service was required to conduct ID monitoring checks to ensure that only British citizens and residents, not undocumented migrants, or anyone who was an overseas visitor was accessing its services. The Home Office required universities to strengthen their monitoring of migrant students and migrant university staff in order to maintain their sponsorship licenses. Immigration raids and deportations against migrant street homeless people intensified. And then when Brexit happened and the end of free movement, which also meant the Immigration Act of 2020, which meant the end of EU free movement, EU citizens were now subjected to the carceral system of the hostile environment policy. Prior to that, they weren't really on the radar of the Home Office. So basically, the Home Office, through the hostile environment policy, through Theresa May's policy, sought to create as many barriers as possible by criminalizing undocumented migrants and forcing them into self-deportation. And I think what people have forgotten is that, it didn't just affect undocumented migrants and also those on visas. But again, if you are a British citizen who has been street homeless for a number of years and you're without ID and you're estranged from family, it makes it very difficult for you to actually maintain yourself in this country and prove that you are a British citizen. And so in 2018, Guardian journalist Amelia Gentleman published an investigative piece and found that British subjects of Caribbean, Black African, and South Asian descent who had migrated to the UK between 1948 to 1973, known as this Windrush generation, had been wrongly detained, denied legal rights, and threatened with deportation, or having been deported out of the UK. And of course, the hostile environment policy had accelerated these issues, these cases. And I want to mention that I think it's really interesting that Amelia Gentleman broke the case of the Windrush generation because she's married to Joe Johnson. Joe Johnson was an MP, Conservative Party MP. He is the younger brother of Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson is her brother-in-law. And it's really interesting. These are two, and her husband and her brother-in-law were two people who were instrumental in the hostile environment policy. So it's really interesting how this Guardian journalist, is sort of tied to the hostile environment, even though she was celebrated for her coverage of the hostile of the Windrush generation cases.
And Sanaz, so you've described basically this is ensuring through criminalization, but also through what are really just like civic forms of participation in public life, making it impossible to exist. And what's the, like you've talked about racism and whiteness. What is the purpose of such policies, and who are the targets?
Right. I want to say that the hostile environment is something that's not necessarily seen. It's not, as if you're a British citizen, you don't really see it. Of course, you very much see it and experience it as a migrant. And so this is why it's so insidious. But also what makes it even more insidious is that it makes everyday people into border cops. And when I say everyday people, I also mean migrants themselves in positions. So this is one aspect of why it is very insidious. So you are affected by bordering processes, but you're also having to carry out these processes in a number of ways. You say who it's done to affect. Well, as again, I've mentioned, it was to bring down net migration, to target undocumented people, but it sort of, careened out into migrants themselves who have legal right to remain. And it's also really around, again, maintaining Britain as a white country. That's really where it's coming from. So yeah, it's really that, and it's a control mechanism, because if you make migrants feel insecure, and obviously if you feel insecure within the system, you're not going to want to stay for very long in the country. If you think about it, if you make becoming a British citizen a very difficult, arduous policy, also in a very expensive policy, then why would you want to remain in the country? So it's about keeping migrants in flux, essentially, whether you are undocumented or someone on a visa.
And I mean, I think we can all imagine what the impact is. So the next question I'm going to ask is redundant, but the impact is clearly to make life impossible, to make participation in public life impossible.
Exactly. I mean, when the hostile environment policy was introduced, again, Theresa May had these go home bans, and this was, I believe, around 2013, and it was specifically targeted racialized communities with a high migrant, population. I mean, she wasn't going into like the ritzy part. She wasn't going into Belgravia and London or Knightsbridge. She was going into, very like East London, for example, or East End or other places. So obviously, it's extremely racialized colonial way of doing basically bordering, and that's really where it's coming from. Of course, it was more or less centered around London. But I have to say, with regards, I mean, I think we were going to talk about what does the resistance look like. And
Yes.
Again, that's when, the anti-raids network was established in 2012 by London-based groups and individuals to stop immigration raids in the community and to teach community people how to stop raids. I mean, I want to just say that the landscape of anti-deportation, anti-detention work, had long been done by racialized communities, from the late 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and then this kind of dissipated over time. There's ebbs and flows to this type of work. And of course, the anti-raids network was more or less established in London, and then it sort of metastasized into Bristol, Edinburgh, Leeds, Liverpool, Manchester, Sheffield. And of course, in Glasgow in May of 2021, we had the Battle of Kenmure Street and the mass street protests preventing the detention of 2 Indian nationals that made not just national news in the UK, but international news as well, because no one had ever seen something like that before. And there have been campaigns to address various aspects of the hostile environment policy, such as Docs Not Cops, which was created in 2014 by health professionals advocating to end the immigration checks within the NHS and to end the international health surcharge fee, and also upfront charges for undocumented migrants to access the NHS. The group that I helped establish, as you mentioned, Unis Resist Border Controls, was formed in 2016 as a migrant-led national grassroots campaign against the hostile environment policy as practiced within universities through pervasive attendance monitoring checks of migrant students. And I'm not entirely sure. I think I want to talk a little bit about that, because universities are also sites of bordering. I mean, we've seen this in the U.S. with the treatment of migrant students who involved in Palestine liberation work, but we've seen the same thing here in the UK as well. And currently, much of the attendance monitoring done is through various apps like Seats, and also Campus M, which is actually operated by a Israeli software company, Ex Libris, and that operates in about 11 or more UK universities. Obviously, these contracts change over time, but there are clear implications and obviously concerns around the potential infringement upon migrant GDPR. And of course, if it's an Israeli company, people are wondering, where is this information stored? Is this on a cloud in the UK, or is this in a cloud server in Israel? There's clear implications there. We as an organization are still trying to find out more information around this. But, you know, not just apps are used in terms of attendance monitoring, but there's also face-to-face visa checks on campus. And this creates, and all of this creates a panopticon environment that harms the learning and environment of students, but also students, it really stops students from taking part in political actions because they're under this extreme panopticon environment in higher education. And I also want to just say it's not, we also have those problems, but we also have universities doing visa weaponization. And we saw this last year with the treatment of Nigerian students who were withdrawn from their university courses and detained and removed from the UK by the Home Office as a result of being unable to pay their tuition fees because of the devaluation of the Naira currency. So there was no amnesty given to these students. And I think I want to say that because they are Black and the racism is just so outstanding that these students were allowed to be put in this situation. There was really no outcry by academics as such. I was on one particular protest at Manchester Metropolitan University, and I'd heard from people tied to University College Union. That branch at Manchester Metropolitan University, UCU, is the Union of Academics. And they basically told their union members, don't come to the protest because if you're a migrant, you too can be implicated. And it was completely false, but it was done to basically scare union members not to come in order to save face with the institution and their employer. So that's just like stuff that we have seen as well.
So can I ask you about the, because I'm sure I am sure that international students subsidize probably a fair portion of the post-secondary system.
Yes.
And there is something so not just hypocritical but also cruel about relying on the tuition that international students pay to prop up a post-secondary system that everyone ostensibly would benefit from, and at the same time then hunting down those same international students. So how does that work?
Oh, goodness. Well, I mean, it doesn't work. That's the problem. But UK universities are cash-strapped and they are extracting a lot from migrant students. And there really isn't much of a pushback to any of this. I mean, even though, for example, the National Union of Students, of course, as I mentioned, University College Union, have both said that they're opposed to the hostile environment policy, but they have not done anything constructively. And I feel with, you know, when Nicola was talking about, you know, dealing, that there isn't any systemic policy to push back on, you know, what he sees or what, you know, he's experiencing in Serbia in terms of bordering processes. It's sort of the same thing with the hostile environment. You know, I mean, as an organization, we have done casework on a number of individual cases of students who have been affected in universities as a result of the hostile environment policy. But again, there has been no, it's been very difficult. I mean, we're trying to change that at the moment, you know, create a systemic policy of pushbacks that really target the system, but it's so expansive. And again, you have actors who are not necessarily following in step with you as migrant-led activists, because they're, you know, you're basically pushing back on even, for example, the higher education and the neoliberalized system within higher education, which they in many ways have benefited from over the years. And so I think this is where it's very complicated, very difficult. It's not an easy process by any, you know, stretch of the imagination. So this is where it is.
And it isn't. I mean, what did I want to say? Yes, of course it is, because capitalism and racism and imperialism are all layered on top of one and each other. They're all live and operating on one another at the same time. And I think that the venom and the hostility that you're describing is it is a bordering of whiteness, and I think that our Balkan speakers speak to the price that is paid for that violent policing of whiteness. And of course, I understand that there's nuance to this conversation. Albanians are very visibly white, and yet we're also demonized as dangerous migrants. I understand there's nuance to that conversation, but it is policing not just borders, it's policing the idea of an ethno-state. And
Well,
that is where, yeah.
Can I just say this? I mean, for this whole discourse around Albanian criminals that's been habitual and consistent within the British media, from the far right perspective and the center, and centrist policies and centrist positions and the government itself. I mean, there was a couple of months ago, this was in September of 2024, an Albanian student who came on a student visa talked about coming to the UK, coming to study at City University London on a journalism degree, and really, talking about how he felt there was so much hope that he could graduate, get a post-study work visa, and get a good job as a journalist. And he found that, on the contrary, it was very difficult for him to get a job as a journalist in the UK. Doors closed for him, people didn't hire him, people didn't commission stories from him. And then he ended up working on a building site with other Albanians who had come unlawfully to the UK, probably on small boats. And I mean, none of these Albanians who had come on these small boats and, came unlawfully wanted to be in the UK. I mean, they were sort of forced into that because of economic insecurity in Albania. And he was forced into the same position because of his economic insecurity in the UK and the inability, even with a professional degree, of finding a job, and all the doors blocked to him. And I can only imagine that, because there's been this discourse of of criminal Albanians. People look at him like, why would I want to hire that person when I can give it to somebody else, someone who's British, for example? And that's what's pushed. That's what the hostile environment also pushes in this indirect way. And right now, I mean, we are seeing a resurgence, a very strong resurgence of anti-migrant and Islamophobic, anti-Roma riots. Just last month in Ballymena, there was one. This was basically allegedly 2 Romanian-speaking teenagers were charged with attempting rape and assaulting a teenage girl. And this led to a huge anti-migrant riot, an anti-Roma riot as well, where racialized migrants were attacked, had their homes ransacked, torched by rioters. This was about, I think, 4 or 5 days of this. And then currently, right now, in the suburb outside of London called Epping Forest, a hotel housing asylum seekers under detention has been the site of fascist protest and violence that, I mean, could really, truly erupt, even further. We are just a few days shy of the first anniversary of the anti-migrant, anti-Muslim riots that engulfed the entire UK following fueling by the far right of allegations that the person who perpetuated the mass stabbings that claimed the lives of 3 children in Southport was the work of a Muslim asylum seeker. Of course, that was not the case.
It was not, yeah.
But that led to a lot of, Islamophobic violence, a lot of, there was, migrants in hotel detention who, had riots outside of, there are hotels getting torched. I mean, all of those things. And then, of course, you have, like, just a few months ago, Keir Starmer talking about an island of strangers. And I mean, the Labour government is actively playing into this discourse. And it's not going to it's not going to end until we have a truthful discussion about, colonialism, of imperialism, obviously, capitalism, etc.
And I'm aware of the time, which is why I want to now transition to the United States and to speak with Merita. And I am going to make an executive decision as moderator and tack on another 10 minutes, just so our viewers know, because I think that what we're seeing in the United States is, it's not just brutal, but it's also, at least, as someone who's not an American, this level of violence towards migrants and refugees in the United States, it seems unprecedented. And And Merita, I'm going to start with a much broader question because I want to try to keep the links between the Balkans and the global North. I want to try to keep them front of mind. From your perspective, how do you see the treatment of migrants in the global North as being connected to the experiences of the Balkans that we heard about earlier?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to chat about the unprecedented nature later on. I think just to position my own story, growing up in a mixed status family in the US and in other places, that there is this emphasis on keeping your head down, follow the rules, definitely not being politically active. There is this genuine belief that meritocracy is real. You know, if you get in line and stay in line for over 20 years, in some cases, like my dad and my uncles, that you will make it, that the American dream is yours. But that rule following really causes you to believe that anyone in the immigration system that is being punished is because of something they did, and not that it is deeply entrenched in the racism in this country. There must be an explanation that is rooted in the individual and not the system. And I've seen that attitude lead to rapid assimilation in our communities, where our people who were themselves undocumented are now the ones delivering the same anti-immigrant rhetoric to newcomers. And so I think connecting it to the Balkans is these experiences in the Balkan, we are exporting that treatment there as we're exporting these sites of detention. We talked earlier about going from this place of transit, Balkans, that was the rhetoric of the Balkans, to now it is becoming this place of detention. And we know what happens in detention. There's brutality of nationals within the country, let alone newcomers who might not speak the language, are definitely not getting the care needed. There aren't the structural supports for that. And so I'm trying to keep my answer short because of the time.
No, no, Merita, you and I will continue for as long as we would like. That's not true.
I'm a talker.
Ashik said we can go up to 5:45 CEST.
Okay, got it.
So we do have time.
Okay, great.
And I wanted to ask you about what are the equivalent of hostile environment policies in the United States? And I'm thinking not just with respect to incarceration, but also access to basic services that you need in order to meaningfully participate in civic life.
Yeah, one thing I would say in the US, because there's a lot happening beyond the brutality of immigration right now. I really think immigration, the detention, deportation that we're seeing is being used as a testing ground for the authoritarianism and fascism that this administration is preparing for everyone, not just good immigrants, but even people born here. Definitely there are racialized components there, but there is really an ideological shift in who is, taken care of, that we've seen with the Trump administration. So I want to root it in that. I'll list a few examples related to immigration, though. So there have been efforts to remove access to public services such as healthcare and even public schools. I live in Chicago, and there is a deliberate targeting of cities and states that are viewed as sanctuary, that have sanctuary policies, which I can get into in a little bit. You also see allowing ICE, which is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, to go into places that they weren't allowed, places like hospitals, schools, churches, places of worship were seen as these sites of refuge for protection, and those protections are being rolled back. like I mentioned with the targeting, making an example of cities like Chicago, that is not even just affecting immigration, but it affects funding. And so when you get this scarcity of funding, it leads to austerity budgets. It leads to creating, you know, a divide and conquer approach. So in Chicago, you see a lot of Black versus Brown, newcomers versus older immigrants, a lot of tensions, even locally in local politics, that are affecting way beyond immigration because we already don't have enough funds, and our funds in the US are very focused on those who are very wealthy. There is also in the US, some public services are, you know, regardless of your status, but you're now seeing what this administration attempts to penalize families who do access healthcare or food aid or some of these other services. On the work permit side, there are a lot of protections being stripped away there, making it harder to get those permits, making it more dangerous to take jobs under the table. On the legal front, you see reduced legal resources. There are fewer judges, so that leads to longer backlogs. You know, in the 80s and 90s, when my family came, it was 20 years. It's of a wait time until they got their papers. It's much longer. There isn't really a line, because if that is a line, that's not an actual system. You also see fewer access to public defendants and lawyers. That means it's easier to violate people's rights. As regarding students, as Sanaz was talking about, there is more targeting around ideology. Especially the college students that were involved in encampments to protest the genocide in Gaza. You're now seeing not only actively kidnapping them on the streets, but also for new international students that are coming in, requiring their social media to be public so that they can screen for ideology and use that as the basis for whether they are even allowed to come to this country, to the universities that they have been accepted to. A couple more examples really quick. Crossing the border in the US used to be a civil offense tried in civil court. There is a change trying to criminalize it. So it becomes yet another way to criminalize people that may be fleeing persecution or other not safe situations. ICE, as I mentioned earlier, which hasn't even existed. I'm older than ICE. It hasn't even existed for that long. You now see, because despite the incredible amount of money this country spends on militarization and national security, there are not enough ICE police to do all the deportation raids that this administration hopes. And so they have now deputized not only other agents to do that work, other agencies are taken away from the work they are doing to assist with these deportation raids, but they're also trying to expand that ability to civilians so that you essentially report on your neighbors. So what does that sound like to you, creating an environment where you are reporting on each other? We have seen this in history. The last thing, examples I'll talk about is around data. For my day job, I work in tech, and there's a whole conversation around digital surveillance that could be its own talk. But you all may have seen Elon Musk getting unprecedented access to data. And so you have immigrants in this country that pay taxes and get none of the benefits, and they're trying to get fewer benefits. They are now taking data from taxes and healthcare and these other systems to target immigrants. And also, there are huge contracts, such as with Palantir, to create national data surveillance systems, which will definitely be used on citizens as well. But you get buy-in by saying we're only going to use it on the other now. And as a side note, Palantir, the CEO, Peter Thiel, propped up JD Vance, who is our vice president, his entire career. And as somebody that is potentially going to become our president, depending on what happens with Trump, it is a really dangerous precedent, the privatization that we're seeing. And not only the privatization, but there are also, you know, we've talked about stripping away rights for most of the immigrants we see that have a great need. On the same side, you also see expansion of, you know, gold card visas. So if you invest $5 million, you can come into the US. There's this shift also into what kind of immigrants are valued towards this ultra wealthy immigration that is rooted in the racism, but also is very specific in terms of capitalism.
So, so Merita, this is, you know, my next question is going to be, you know, what's the purpose of all of this? And we can say that the cruelty is the point, and I think that to a certain extent, the cruelty is the entire point. But you mentioned some things. You said that these are practices that are being exercised on migrants and refugees and undocumented people because generally those are seen as people that we don't care about. And so we can exercise all forms of control over them. And you said something along the lines of, once you do that with people who are undocumented or migrants or refugees or vulnerable in some way, you set the stage to then do that to citizens as well. And you also mentioned making an example of sanctuary cities like Chicago. So from your point of view, what do you think is the point of all this?
I think the point is flexing their power. It's a warning call to put you in your place and to prevent dissent. And we have seen that in history. You know, what they're doing is intentionally creating an environment that breeds fear and creates vulnerability for everyone. You know, even citizens have been deported wrongfully. They're stripping away due process. They're trying to create this fear of, oh, it could be me. Like Stanaz was saying, when you're saying, oh, don't show up, it's dangerous for you too. That really seeks to undermine solidarity, which is the most important tool against fascism, and is a lot of what we're doing today too. It's so important to understand each other's stories and to connect the collective struggles and to really show up in this moment. Two other purposes I'll touch on really quickly. It's a denial of responsibility as an imperialist empire that creates these conditions in other countries that causes people to come here. I think there is this myth of choice, you know, they're coming for your jobs, but really nobody wants to leave home. We know that nobody like chooses to leave home unless it is such a you know, hostile environment. And so that is often created by imperialist countries like the US. And it's just abdicating of that responsibility that you are essentially the root cause, you're reaping what you sowed. And another, you know, just to touch on too, it's to continue capitalist exploitation by being able to abuse undocumented people. You know, when you think about labor or housing, landlords, like there is always this threat of if you don't comply, if you don't accept these conditions, we will report you. Like you are always at risk. You always have to be watching your back. And so again, keeping your head down, not dissenting, not speaking up against injustices. Yeah.
And look, I think that we can all have a very clear sense of what kind of devastation this causes for individuals and families. But I'm hoping that you can speak to what's the impact that you're witnessing on the people who are targeted, and from where you are, what kind of organizing strategies are being used to help protect migrants and newcomers and undocumented people in the US?
Yeah, I'd say overall the impact is dehumanization and violence. And when you think about dehumanizing conditions, it really breeds this shame and isolation. And when you think about the violence, there's this incredible feel, almost psychological terror. And so those are really powerful weapons to control a population. And the violence is not just, you know, to undocumented folks facing deportation. The protests and, you know, attempts to de-arrest and other local raids that we've seen, they are getting more violent. You see these ICE officers with huge AK-47s and literally almost running over my friends. Like this is, I will forever and always bring up Biden and Obama's role. This is a bipartisan, you know, attempt to protect empire, but there is some disregard for human life that is renewed in this administration. And so when you have that isolation, and some of it is very intentional, you know, there is very clear policies to separate families. Also, not even just separating families, but you constantly have you're constantly seeing people move. This is kind of like what Christina was saying around the case in Albania, where in Chicago especially, and this will kind of get into the sanctuary city, I'll get to that in a minute. There were about 800 to 1,000 buses of refugee asylum seekers shipped from Texas to Chicago and other cities that were considered sanctuary cities, using people as political pawns. And so you have this movement across the US, so they can't settle in an established community or connect with other organizers who are trying to fight with them. And now you're not just seeing that within the borders, but you're seeing people sent to El Salvador, and now getting ready to send to the Balkans, where at least in El Salvador, you maybe know the language, but how are you going to speak with prison guards who can't even communicate with you? So, you know, there's family separation breeds not just that lack of ability to create solidarity, but poor outcomes for families, families being put into the foster system, which affects domestic populations as well. Labor exploitation, healthcare, you know, we are still in a pandemic, and that makes all of us less safe when you are afraid to seek healthcare. I sit on the local school counselor in my school council, and the day after Trump's inauguration, our attendance rate of students, because this is a predominantly immigrant neighborhood, and most students that attend that school come from mixed status families, dropped to 68% that first day because people are keeping their kids home from school. They were afraid what would happen on the way to school or even at school. Now that, you know, in Chicago, we have strong unions, and we have actually negotiated into the contract not to allow ICE officials into our schools. But that is not the case in most of the US. And so
And can I ask
you
you
have
about school? Can I ask you about
Yeah.
schools? Because I understand that there's a practice of surveying schools because parents will always show up to pick up their kids from school and drop them off at school. And is that also part of the concern around schools, that those are places that are watched?
Yes, that is why a lot of people keep their kids home, because either your kid is undocumented and going to school, or you are undocumented and taking them, or both. I will, this is a good, I think, transition to the organizing piece. I think right now, like, to kind of spin this into more of, you know, what is being done on the ground and some hope, because hope is a practice, as Miriam Kaba says, who is a prison industrial complex abolitionist. I will say that locally, what I've seen, you had similar numbers of deportation and similar funding of this system, this carceral system under Biden and Obama. But a lot of, you know, mainstream liberals, Democrats were checked out, not really paying attention. And one thing that is positive is the you know, Trump is such a showman, and the show that he's putting on is actually activating people to get involved in politics and defense. And so locally, a couple of things that we have been doing that have been really effective strategies. There is some element of our work that is centered around elections, but not just elections for the sake of elections. We cultivate our community organizers and elect them to city and state seats. You know, there's a lot more you can do locally in the US than in Congress. Congress is totally bought by money. But that has led to the creation of, both at the city level and the state level, these sanctuary policies. And what the sanctuary policy means is that police cannot participate in, like local police, Chicago or state police, cannot participate in supporting or assisting in any capacity with ICE operations, you know, the law enforcement operations of an immigration agent. And so that includes active support, like actually barring protesters, but also data sharing, which is that could be a whole separate talk. Like I said, these are huge weapons in this moment, thinking about data surveillance and how that is being used to target people. So we have those protections, a lot of places don't. And because we have these electeds in these positions, we have to constantly uphold those protections, because police will always collaborate with each other. And we need to keep holding them accountable to what the law actually says. Mutual aid is another area I want to talk about. Mutual aid is a really radical act for these times of hostility. Just to give a little bit of explainer, mutual aid is collective coordination to meet each other's needs. Usually it comes from an awareness that the systems we have in place are not going to meet them. And so there are three things that are central to mutual aid. And if you are interested in mutual aid, I highly recommend reading Dean Spade. But the three things are building shared understanding about why people do not have what they need. So political education is very important. Mutual aid projects also mobilize people, expand solidarity, and build movements so that there's collective struggle and fighting. And mutual aid programs are participatory. They solve problems through collective action rather than waiting for saviors, which we talked about earlier in terms of imperialism and white savior complex and all that. And so one thing that I've spent the last few years working on is in Chicago, we had 50,000 new arrivals escaping from Venezuela. That is a long way to travel, and not just Venezuela, but that was kind of the narrative, and that was where the majority of people came from. And so we really created a citywide system of mutual aid that even the mayor's office in Chicago said the city would not have been able to handle that influx had it not been with the mutual aid networks. So, which is a whole other interesting commentary about the state relying on mutual aid that I could go into for hours. So mutual aid is another one, other than the elections and the inside outside strategy. The third one I want to talk about is our ICE watch, or Migra watch, which is a Spanish word for immigration officers. So it is really rooted in the Black Panther Cop Watch history. And so we have had a lot of trainings in Chicago on how to watch officials, because we have some protections. And so depending on how they conduct a raid, there may be opportunity to take people out of detention and their deportation hearings. Sometimes, and you need everybody in the group, right? You need people that are legal observers, but sometimes you have more anarchist tendencies who may attempt to de-arrest. But all that to say that ICE trainings are very important, because throughout Chicago, we have like 24 neighborhood rooted defense networks. So we have a signal channel where it's like, hey, there has been a spotting. And the way that we know there's a spotting is either monitoring like Facebook groups, neighborhood groups, or we have a hotline that we have publicized very loudly, where if you see somebody in trouble, if you need help, call this hotline. And so this hotline gets this information, it sends it to whatever neighborhood it's happening in, and then you have 30 to 50 people in that chat that say, I'm close, I can get there in 5 minutes. And then you go there and you know, multiple people either to observe, document, like make sure to follow them to make sure they have legal aid and representation. So these ICE Watch and the neighborhood defense networks are incredibly important. They're so important. And it's not just watching ICE, it's also doing canvasses, which is knocking on doors and handing out flyers at like train stations to share know your rights information, to share the hotline information. These have been such effective tools for us to really stall and weaken Trump's effects, that Trump's director of ICE went on national TV and said, Chicago is very well educated. They're making it really hard for us to conduct ICE arrests. You're making our jobs so hard. Please stop.
Okay.
And I can go on, but I'll leave it there because thanks for telling us our tactics are working.
So, you know, this is what I did want to bring the conversation back to, that everything really does matter. It all matters, not in ways that we can plainly see, but we know that it does. Because what I've heard this morning is examples of really amazing organizing, monitoring, documentation, reporting, and direct aid. And those are all actions that build movements. And you know, to the viewers who are still here, I know that we've ran about 10 minutes over. I think we have maybe 5 minutes left. I wanted to pause for just a moment to see if there's anyone here that had a burning question. Sanaz, do you have a question for any of the other speakers?
No, but I wanted to make a point. It's actually quite important, and it ties into what has been previously said. It's about the criminalization of direct action. Earlier this month in the UK, Palestine Action was proscribed, meaning that it's an outlawed terrorist group. And this means that anyone who holds any signs or shows any support for Palestine Action can be, under the Terrorism Act of 2000, be arrested and face up to 14 years in prison. So people that are involved in Palestine Action are also implicated in this as well. I'm bringing this up because we are seeing the criminalization using terrorism, using counterterrorism and other legislative means, around Palestine. And this will have a reverberation in terms of our work in solidarity as abolitionists as well, because the government, I mean, I'm sure that Trump is looking at this. And I know that when Trump says something, it's so bombastic that people listen and they get really worried. But here, this is a labor government that's done that. So clearly, we have no right of freedom of speech because they've done this now. And freedom of direct action.
Yeah, it doesn't matter which party. In the US, we only have two, and it's a bipartisan effort to do this. The equivalent of what you're talking about, in case anybody wants to read about it in the US, is called Project Esther. It is a plan that they have to essentially, because there is such a strong Israeli lobby in the US, it is a plan that any critique of the Israeli state is viewed as anti-Semitic. And so through that, you can face all of these punishments. And there have been dozens of laws across the country. And because we have states and cities and such, you know, such a fabric of different conditions, it really is something that they are using Gaza and the support for Palestinians as another testing ground. So you have immigration and Palestine and like working in solidarity with each other of really trying to criminalize not just direct action around these issues, but truly anything. I mean, think about environmentalism. I know there was a panel earlier about feminism. It really is a divide and conquer tactic, and we can't let it work. That's why we are connecting struggles in this panel, and I'll hand it back to Hannah.
I have many thoughts about the way that Palestinians' freedom of movement is restricted and freedom of political expression. And yes, full agreement with all the sentiments expressed by you, Merita and Sanaz. But in light of the time, I think this is the end of our time together today. I want to thank each and every one of you individually for sharing your expertise, sharing your compassion and solidarity. Building these kinds of connections for me means a lot because these struggles can feel incredibly isolating. And I truly value the fact that I'm connected with you all in a way that I wasn't earlier. I did want to invite, I wanted to invite Ashik into the call actually, because there has been conversation, I understand, inside the Balkan Solidarity Network about transforming this discussion into some form of concrete action. And I would like it if a BSN organizer could maybe get on camera and discuss what that might look like. So Ashik has messaged me with a few options. A working group, an in-person meeting, some kind of call to action. Can you say more about that?
Of course. So part of why we wanted to do these conversations is to first discuss some of the ideas, but then to try to apply those things, bring people together. But then what? To try to brainstorm some ways of collaborating. And clearly there are some patterns, some parallels that have appeared throughout this discussion in different contexts, but having these discussions kind of help to draw out those parallels. But after that, now what? Do we feel like there is a need for more of a regional conversation, specifically around migration, around border resistance? Are there people interested in creating a working group within the Balkan Solidarity Network where we discuss this? Would anyone like to volunteer to do this? Or maybe we could create some sort of a newsletter of what's happening around the region, just so that we're all aware. I know many comrades around the region who are doing great work within their context, but I feel like there is also some benefit in sharing some of these things. So I'm wondering if raise your hand, react, or just say so if you'd like to be a part of this working group. All right, Sanaz. Hannah. And we will follow up in the next week regarding the future steps.
Hi.
Hi, Taf.
You start or waiting for the group?
Waiting. We're just
Waiting?
finishing
Yeah.
the last discussion.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, but thank you everyone. Hannah, thank you so much. Thank you to all the speakers. This was amazing. Really, I learned a lot. And yeah, I think in terms of next steps, a few people can take the lead, and then we can put out a larger call for others to get involved to the extent that they're able to, what their capacity allows for. But yeah, thank you again.
Thank you, everyone.
Welcome. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Now,
Goodbye. Hugs and solidarity.
I gotcha. Ashik, you want to stop the recording?
Mhm.